That's one of the reasons, those are the reasons, you just identified a bunch of them, why higher ed tends to receive the cuts. We had no general fund money for transportation or capital. We saw serious reductions in Medicaid services. Even though we know as unemployment rises, the number of people who don't have insurance rise, the demand for Medicaid increases. But what do? Because we don't have any choice, we lower the amount of money that we pay to providers. Then what happens? Providers don't provide services, which means we have more people who don't have insurance, and you understand how that cycle works. Same thing with public health services. I always put this one up here because this was a personal one for me. You know how so much of this stuff, it doesn't make any sense to you in the generic, but when it comes to hit you, live in your own home, it suddenly starts to make a lot of sense. We completely eliminated state expenditures for public health and relied completely on county and federal dollars. Well, coincidentally, maybe, during this period, we had a whooping cough epidemic in the state of Colorado. My family was exposed to whooping cough. We had a $260, $270 bill to pay for the prophylactic antibiotics that my entire family had to take. Again, I think it's a great example of that cutting that collective public contribution and moving it to the responsibility of individuals. Luckily, we were in a position where my family could afford to do that. But we have to think about the families that we all consider in our work on a day-to-day basis, what that would have meant to their monthly budget. Now, what's going to happen this time? Probably pretty much the same things, because of the thing that the important fact you identified earlier, that we don't have a lot of choices in the budget. There's only a few places we can go. We will be going, the legislature will be going to sources that have support beyond the general fund. Read higher education. There will be attempts to, and hopefully some successful efforts to increase fees, because that's something that can be done. Even though we all understand that's a big burden in the middle of a recession when people's incomes are falling. But we have to ask ourselves, what are the trade-offs? Do you want to pay a little bit more in a fee to make sure that we don't lose Medicaid for big sections of our population and have the ripple effect of that as we go forward? We know we're going to be reducing some cash fund balances. Part of the problem here is we've done this. We did this the last time around. And it was so close in proximity, we haven't had chances to get those cash balances back up again. There aren't big cash balances out there to grab and pull in as a temporary one-time thing. We also will see reductions in our reserves. We have a 4% statutory reserve. And people say, well, isn't that a rainy day fund? No, it's really not a rainy day fund. It's basically a cash flow fund. You know, when you're writing in your own checkbook, you know, some months there's a lot of expenses, and so you need to have a little balance in there so that when you have to write more checks, you don't go below. Well, that's what this is. But we're now using it to fund operations because we don't have any choice unless we want to start cutting to the bone, because in Colorado we don't really fund public services very generously. And in a constrained time like this, it means significant reductions in help to families. Now, what's different than last time? Well, one of the big things is the federal stimulus. Colorado expects to receive about $2.88 billion in new federal money over the next 2 years. About $1.63 billion of that can be used in some way or another to offset cuts. It's dollars that can be used in the general fund budget to help with Medicaid, to help with K-12 education, to help with operating in higher education. But another $1.2 billion of it are new investments, money that's coming to do things we would have never done had it not been for these dollars. That's the real stimulus money. This is the money that's designed to get people back to work, designed to get people, get them so that they are eligible for their UI, eligible for their food stamps. This is the real, when I think about it, this is what's being helped to keep us, this is the money that we're getting to keep from, help reduce the size of the cuts that we have to make, and that really it's the $1.2 billion that is the stimulus. The other thing I have to note here is, one thing I don't talk about in this slide is the tax cuts that were included in the stimulus package. And it's really hard to talk about to figure out what the effect in Colorado is of those, and that's the reason they're not there. Now, what should happen? From the perspective of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy and the Fiscal Policy Institute, folks that are really devoted, our mission every day is to strive for economic justice and economic self-sufficiency for all Colorado families. What we think needs to happen is we've got to protect the safety net. We've got to feed families. There's a nasty little secret out there. We don't have enough money in county departments to process the applications to get people eligible for food stamps. The money to pay for those food stamps doesn't come from the Colorado state budget. It's federal money. It is available. But we don't have enough dollars to get the folks determined eligible in county offices. And if you were to talk to Roxanne, she might have had some insight in that conversation. So we think that our #1 priority ought to be to protect that safety net, get families fed, and make sure that they have health care. Because if you're sick, just happen to be in the middle of a recession, it stinks if that's the reason you're not getting health insurance or provided health care. So those are the two things we think we should prioritize first. The next thing we need to do is really make strategic investments that create jobs. Whether we use some of those fees that we're talking about at the state level to create employment, or we just maximize that $1.25 billion in federal money to make sure that we've got people working. Because you need people working so that they pay income taxes and buy things so that we can have sales taxes, so that we have the dollars to provide child care and health care and, quite frankly, K-12 education and higher education. So we got to get people working. Plus there's a whole bunch of other good reasons to work. The last thing is that we need to see this as an opportunity to think about the future. Can we do something now to come out of this situation better off than when we went in? Somebody said to me, you can't waste a good crisis. Well, we feel pretty strongly about that. We find ourselves having conversation and dialogue that we would have never imagined that we could have had because of the change in economic circumstances. We want to be sure that we stay laser focused on using this unique moment to try to make changes that have the state come out of this better than we went into it. I've talked about all this. Now, as we prepare for the recovery, and I want to talk a little bit about this last idea. How many of you know about the TABOR amendment? How many of you know about Referendum C? How many of you know about Amendment 23? How many of you know about the Arveschoug bird provision? Oh, this is a pretty good audience. Generally, people look at me like, what? Well, we have not only constitutional provisions that are constraining our ability to do what we need to do in this state, but we also have statutory constraints. And they're statutory constraints that, quite frankly, have just led to bad decisions and a lack of accountability over the last 15 or 16 years. And in the case of this Arveschoug bird provision, the legislature has shackled themselves. It's enough of a constraint that voters have imposed rules on what our elected officials can do to get us out of problems. But when our elected officials choose to shackle themselves, to keep themselves tied up, that's when those of us on the outside have to start rattling the cages a little bit. And that's what's happened with this Arveschoug bird thing, and we think it's time for them to unshackle themselves from their old bad habits.